This is the story of Daniel Hartwell and his wife Chloe Hartwell. They had built something real, or at least something that resembled real, which for a long time felt like the same thing. Daniel was the kind of man who showed love through consistency. The coffee made before she woke, the bills paid quietly, the way he remembered small things she'd mentioned once and never again. Chloe was the kind of woman who needed to be seen, not just known, but witnessed, admired, reflected back to herself in the eyes of the people around her. For 7 years, these two needs had orbited each other without quite colliding, creating a marriage that looked from the outside like contentment. What neither of them had examined closely enough was the slow, structural fatigue building beneath the surface. The way Chloe had begun to feel invisible in a life that was entirely comfortable, and the way Daniel had begun to confuse her silence with satisfaction. This is a story about the difference between devotion and desire, and the terrible cost of learning that difference too late. The kitchen in the Hartwell house on Meridian Street was the kind that real estate listings called warm. Butcher block counters, a window above the sink that looked out onto a yard they'd meant to landscape properly for 3 summers running. Daniel stood at the stove on a Saturday morning in late October, pushing eggs around a pan with the focused quietness of a man who had performed this ritual so many times it had become a form of meditation. Chloe came downstairs in the oversized flannel shirt she'd claimed from his side of the closet years ago and never returned. Her hair was still flattened from sleep on one side. She moved to the coffee pot without looking at him, poured a mug, and stood at the window with both hands wrapped around it, looking out at the unfinished yard. "Frost last night," she said. "Yeah." He slid the eggs onto 2 plates. Finally, she didn't turn around. He set her plate at the island and sat across from where she would sit, and they ate the meal together in the comfortable, slightly hollow way of 2 people who have long since stopped needing to fill every silence, but have also, somewhere along the way, stopped choosing to. This was not unhappiness exactly. It was something harder to name, a kind of low-grade stillness that had settled over everything, like dust on furniture you'd stopped noticing. They had met at a mutual friend's gallery opening 9 years ago. Daniel had been standing in front of a large canvas he didn't understand, holding a glass of wine he didn't particularly want, when Chloe had appeared beside him and said, without preamble, "It's supposed to make you uncomfortable. That's the whole point." He had looked at her, the directness of her, the way she occupied space without apology, and thought, without fully understanding why, this one will change things. She had, just not always in the directions he'd anticipated. They married after 2 years, bought the house on Meridian. Daniel's architectural firm grew steadily, if not spectacularly. Chloe had worked in arts administration for a nonprofit that was perpetually underfunded and perpetually meaningful to her, until 4 years ago when the funding collapsed entirely and she'd shifted into freelance event curation, a title that sounded more defined than the work actually was. She planned things, openings, fundraisers, private parties. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things that allow them to be the center of a room without technically being the performer. They're friends, and they had a healthy social ecosystem, described them as solid, Daniel and Chloe, the kind of couple people reference when trying to reassure themselves that long marriages aren't all slow deterioration. What those friends didn't see was the particular way Chloe went quiet in the car on the way home from dinner parties. The way she would look out the passenger window with her reflection ghosted in the glass and not say anything for whole stretches of highway. Daniel noticed. He had always noticed what he hadn't done, what he kept choosing, in small and incremental ways, not to do, was ask. It felt safer to let the silence pass, to assume it would resolve itself, to believe that the next morning's coffee and the consistent presence and the quiet, undemonstrative love he offered daily would be, eventually, enough. Marcus Cole had been Chloe's colleague for about a year. He worked adjacent to her world, a gallery director with a wry wit and the particular social competence of someone who had never been made to feel that his opinions were inconvenient. He appeared in her stories the way secondary characters do when they are not yet understood to be significant, casually, without announcement. "Marcus thinks we should move the opening to March. Marcus found this incredible venue in the warehouse district." Daniel had met him twice, found him perfectly affable, felt nothing about him, specifically because there was nothing yet to feel. One evening in early November, they were getting ready for a birthday dinner for their friend Petra. Chloe stood in front of the bathroom mirror, applying lipstick with the focused deliberation she gave to very few things. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, already dressed, watching her in the way he sometimes did when he was reminded, suddenly, almost inconveniently, that he still found her beautiful. "You look good," he said. She caught his eyes in the mirror for just a moment, then looked back at herself. "I look fine," she said, and something about the way she said it, not modestly, not fishing for reassurance, but with a kind of weary verdict, landed in his chest in a way he didn't examine until much later. They went to the dinner. They came home. They turned out the lights. December arrived and brought with it the particular social density of the pre-holiday season. The parties, the fundraisers, the gallery events that occupied Chloe's calendar in colored blocks she reviewed each morning on her phone while still in bed. Daniel would sometimes glance at the screen when she held it above her and think, with a kind of detached observation, that he could identify less than half the names she texted. This was not accusation, even internally. It was simply noticing. Chloe had always had a social life that extended beyond him. He had never considered this threatening. What he had begun to notice more recently was that she seemed to come alive in those external spaces in ways that she no longer did at home. She would return from events with a particular brightness in her eyes, a looseness in how she moved, a willingness to talk that had become rare in the house on Meridian. She'd tell him stories from the evenings in a way that made it clear she'd already rehearsed them for someone else first. One Wednesday evening, she came home from a planning session, Marcus's gallery, the spring exhibition, and she was laughing before she'd even fully closed the door. He was reading in the living room. She came in and told him a story about a miscommunication involving a caterer and a conceptual installation that had nearly resulted in bruschetta being served on a piece the artist considered sacred. The story was genuinely funny. She told it well. "Sounds like a good night," he said. "It was, actually." She dropped her bag and sat at the other end of the couch, pulling her feet up. "It's nice to work with someone who takes the work seriously, but doesn't take himself seriously, you know?" He did know. He also knew that this was the most animated she'd been in the house in several weeks. He turned a page of his book without reading it. "You should come to the opening in March," she said, almost as an afterthought. "I think you'd like the work." "Sure," he said. "I'll put it in the calendar." She looked at him for a moment, a measuring look, as if trying to determine whether he meant it. He did mean it. He almost said so. Instead, he turned another page. She picked up her phone. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who have learned to be alone together with great efficiency. Later, lying in bed in the dark, Daniel stared at the ceiling and engaged in the kind of thinking he rarely allowed himself during daylight hours. He was 41 years old. He had built a life that, itemized, contained everything he would have said he wanted at 28. House, work, partnership, stability. He loved Chloe, not as a habit, not merely as a fact, but with something that still had texture and weight when he paid attention to it. What he had begun to suspect, with a slowness that made it worse, was that she had stopped paying attention to him in the same way. Not because of Marcus, specifically. He didn't think it was about Marcus. He thought it was about something older than that, some need in her that he had never quite reached, some frequency she'd always been broadcasting that he'd received as background noise. He fell asleep before resolving any of it. The following week, at a dinner with mutual friends, Owen and Priya, who hosted dinners with the regularity and earnestness of people who believe strongly in the maintenance of community, Daniel found himself watching Chloe across the table. She was talking about a show she'd seen, using her hands in that way she did when she was genuinely engaged, and she was directing most of it at Owen, who was leaning slightly forward with his elbows on the table and giving her the complete attention that people give when they find someone both interesting and attractive. She was glowing. Daniel felt no jealousy toward Owen specifically. He felt something more uncomfortable than jealousy. He felt like an observer, like he was watching his wife be fully herself at someone else's dinner table and couldn't quite remember the last time that full version of her had been present on Meridian Street. Priya caught his eye from across the table and gave him one of those small social smiles that mean, "How are you holding up?" And he returned one that said, "Perfectly fine," and they both went back to the conversation. After dinner, standing near the kitchen island while the others drifted toward the living room, Daniel poured himself a second glass of wine, and Priya stood beside him and said quietly, "She's been happier lately, don't you think?" He looked at his glass. "She has. That project must be going well." "Yeah," he said. "She loves that kind of work." He said it simply, without bitterness. Priya looked at him for a beat longer than necessary, and then said nothing, which told him that she had registered something in his voice that he hadn't fully intended to put there. On the drive home, Chloe hummed along to something on the radio. Not a performance of contentment, just a genuine, unguarded moment of being in her own good mood. He drove and thought, without quite forming the thought completely, "When did I stop being the source of that?" She glanced over at him at a red light. "You're quiet, just tired." She nodded and looked back at the road. The song ended. Neither of them turned it up. It was 2 weeks later, at a small gathering at their friend Petra's apartment, a loose Saturday night thing. A dozen people, good wine, the easy noise of people who know each other well. That had happened. Daniel had stepped away from a conversation to use the bathroom. On his way back, he passed the hallway that ran adjacent to the kitchen, where voices carried clearly despite the ambient noise of the party. He heard Chloe's voice first. That particular register she used when she was saying something she wanted landed, not something she was uncertain about. "I mean, honestly, marrying Daniel was probably the biggest mistake I ever made." Laughter. Not cruel. Just the laughter of people who have been given permission to find something funny. Someone said something he couldn't catch. Chloe's voice again, lighter now. "No, I mean it. I love him, obviously. But sometimes I think I don't know. We wanted different things, and neither of us was honest about it." He stood in the hallway. The rational part of his brain, the part that had spent years constructing a reasonable interior life, registered several things at once. That she was slightly drunk, that she probably believed she was speaking among close friends, that people say things in those conditions that they don't fully mean, and also sometimes exactly mean. He stood there for another moment. Someone shifted in the kitchen and he moved before they could come around the corner and find him there. He returned to the living room. He found Owen and resumed a conversation about a renovation project Owen had been describing earlier. He was pleasant. He was, as far as anyone could tell, entirely present. An hour later, he told Chloe he was tired and was going to head out. She was mid-conversation. She looked up, registered his expression, which he had kept carefully neutral, and said, "I'll get my coat." "Stay," he said. "Petra can drop you, or get a car." She studied him for a moment. The noise of the party continued around them. "You okay?" "Just tired," he said. "For the second time in 2 weeks. Have a good night." He hugged Petra on the way out, shook a few hands, and walked to his car in the cold November air with the particular stillness of a man who has just heard something he cannot unhear and has not yet decided what to do with it. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. Then he drove home, alone. He did not on the drive catastrophize. He did not on that night cry, or call anyone, or sit in the dark with a drink playing cinematic versions of the last 7 years. He made himself tea. He read for an hour. He went to bed. But something had shifted, not broken yet, just moved, the way a bone moves before it fractures. And he lay in the dark and felt it and understood, with great clarity, that he would not pretend he hadn't. Chloe came home at 1:15. He heard the door, heard her move through the kitchen, heard the particular sequence of sounds that meant she was trying to be quiet. The bedroom door opened slowly. He was awake. He said nothing. She undressed in the dark and got into bed, and after a moment said softly, "You awake?" "Yeah." A pause. "What's wrong?" He considered the question. Not the answer, the question. What's wrong was both precisely the right thing to ask and also, he thought, a small, specific version of the larger conversation they had never had. I heard you, he said, in the hallway at Petrus. The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. It had texture. Daniel. I'm not going to make this into something loud, he said. I just want you to know that I heard it. She exhaled. He could feel, without seeing, the way she was arranging herself, not to defend exactly, but to manage. I was drunk. I was venting. It wasn't, you said you loved me. I do. And that marrying me was your biggest mistake. Another silence. That's not fair to reduce it to, I'm not reducing it. That's what you said. I'm not arguing about it, Chloe. I'm just telling you I heard it. He felt her shift beside him. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, less managed. Sometimes I feel like I disappeared, she said. Not because of you, not because of anything you did specifically, but I look at my life and I don't always recognize myself in it. And sometimes when I'm with other people, when I feel like I'm being seen, I think about what it means that I don't feel that way at home, and I don't know what to do with that. He listened. That's not an excuse for what I said. No, he agreed. It's not. But it's honest. I know. He looked at the ceiling. I've known you weren't happy for a while. I kept thinking. I don't know what I kept thinking. That it would shift. I kept thinking the same thing. They lay in the dark, not touching. What do you want? He asked. He asked it without anger, without accusation, with a genuine and slightly devastating curiosity. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it was quietly, I don't know. I think that's the most honest thing I've said in a year. Here is where the story does something unusual. In the pause after Chloe's admission, Daniel turned his head slightly toward the dark middle distance of the room. The way a person does when they're trying to locate a sound. I don't know, he said slowly, speaking to no one in particular, or perhaps to something just beyond the frame. Maybe like this story, or subscribe. He stopped. He almost looked embarrassed. Chloe stared at him. What? He blinked. Turned back. Nothing. Sorry, I don't know why I said that. She looked at him for a long moment, genuinely unsettled. Are you okay? Yeah. He shook his head slightly. I'm fine. I'm sorry. The darkness of the room resettled. The conversation found its footing again, as if a loose floorboard had been stepped over and forgotten. In the morning, he made coffee. She came downstairs. Neither of them addressed the previous night directly. Instead, they moved around each other with a new, careful awareness. Two people who have cracked the surface of something and are not yet certain what is underneath. She left for a meeting. He sat at the kitchen island with his coffee and looked at the unfinished yard. That evening, he called his older brother Theo, the only person in his life whose counsel he trusted, precisely because Theo never told him what he wanted to hear. She said it out loud. Daniel said, which means she's been thinking it a long time. People say things they don't. She meant it, not all of it, but the essential part. A pause on the line. So what are you going to do? I don't know yet. He rubbed his forehead. But I think I've been waiting for her to want to be here for a while, and that's not something I can keep doing. He didn't contact a lawyer the next morning. He didn't confront her again. But he began, quietly and without ceremony, to make certain decisions about what he was willing to carry and what he wasn't. The process was slow. It looked from the outside like nothing. From the inside, it was the most purposeful thing he'd done in years. By March, the separation had been filed. Daniel had done it on a Tuesday, between a 9 o'clock site meeting and a noon client call. His lawyer, a quiet woman named Frances who specialized in these things and brought to them the same unhurried competence he admired in anyone who was good at a difficult job, had said the paperwork would take a few weeks to process. He signed where he needed to sign, drove back to the office, ate a sandwich at his desk. He had told Chloe the Friday before, not as a weapon, he had been careful about that, careful in a way that required real effort, but as information. "I've made a decision," he'd said. "I think you have too, even if you haven't said it yet." She had not denied this. She had cried, which he had not expected and had found in a complicated way, both meaningful and too late. He moved into a short-term rental apartment 4 blocks from the office. It was small and clean and had almost no personality. He liked it in a way that surprised him. What happened to Chloe in the months that followed was more gradual and more internal, and it proceeded through several distinct phases that she was only dimly aware of herself. The first phase was a kind of righteous clarity. She had been unhappy. She had admitted that. The marriage had calcified into something neither of them had fully chosen. The separation was, in some version of the story, a shared outcome rather than a unilateral act. This was not entirely false. She returned to it often. She told Priya, over coffee in early April, that they had both known for a while, and that the separation was probably the most honest thing that had happened between us in years. Priya nodded and said the right things and did not press. She told her sister something closer to the truth, that she felt guilty, specifically, that she felt it was her fault, specifically, but then retracted the specificity in subsequent conversations and replaced it with a more comfortable narrative of mutual incompatibility. Marcus knew by April that she and Daniel had separated. His response had been kind and measured, a brief acknowledgement, a change of subject, a lunch invitation that felt like friendship and not pursuit. She was grateful for this. She was also, if she was honest with herself, which she was becoming slightly better at, slightly disappointed by it, which told her something. The spring exhibition opened in late March. It was a success. She stood in the gallery in a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and felt, for an evening, entirely like herself, seen, admired, competent, present. On the drive home alone, she felt the evening drain away and found what was underneath it. She missed him. Not the habit of him, not the structure of the life they built. She missed Daniel, the Sylvis person, the coffee before she woke up, the way he read in the evenings with the kind of attention she'd always told herself she found boring and had come to understand, was actually the thing she'd liked most about him, his capacity to be completely still. She did not call him to say this. She sat with it instead, in the practiced way of someone learning to sit with things that are both true and useless. In May, her friend Lauren, who had never particularly liked Daniel, a bias Chloe had once found validating and now found suspect, told her she was so much lighter since the separation. "You seem like yourself again." "Yeah," Chloe said. She smiled. She did not say, "I think I was myself before too. I think I was many selves, and I chose to show you the one that agreed with your version of me." She didn't say it because she was still learning that it was true. Daniel, in his small, clean apartment, was doing something that looked to the people who saw him like quiet recovery. In fact, it was something more active than that. He had started going to the climbing gym that Theo had been inviting him to for years. He was reading things he'd been meaning to read. He was spending more time with Owen, who turned out, without the social scaffolding of couple dinners, to be a person Daniel genuinely liked in a way he'd never fully noticed. He was not happy in a simple sense, but he was, slowly, becoming someone he recognized. He thought about Chloe, not constantly, not obsessively, but regularly. The way you think about a long chapter of your life when it is recently finished. He thought about the things he had done wrong, which were real and worth accounting for. The retreating, the waiting for her to be satisfied, rather than asking what satisfaction meant to her, the way he had loved her consistently but not always actively, as if devotion alone was a complete sentence. He thought about the hallway at Petra's party, the way her voice had carried. He had turned that moment over many times, expecting it to calcify into resentment, and found instead something more disquieting, understanding. He understood what she had meant, even while knowing that saying it in a crowded kitchen to mutual friends while he was 30 feet away was its own kind of verdict. In June, he ran into Marcus at a coffee shop. They acknowledged each other with the slightly awkward warmth of people who exist in each other's orbit without quite being of it. "How are you doing?" Marcus asked with what seemed like genuine attention. Better, Daniel said. Actually, better. Marcus nodded. He seemed to want to say something else and decided against it. They parted ways with a kind of courtesy that, in different circumstances, might have become friendship. Daniel took his coffee to a table by the window and sat with it and thought about nothing in particular, and found, to his own mild surprise, that the nothing felt all right. They met in September, nearly 10 months after the night at Petra's party. Not by arrangement, exactly. Chloe had texted in late August asking if he would be willing to meet and go through a few boxes of shared items that remained in storage. The practical scaffolding of a formal ending. He had said yes. They met at the storage unit on a Saturday morning. It was the kind of early September day that is still warm but carries underneath the warmth the first suggestion of autumn, a quality of light that is somehow both abundant and melancholy. She was already there when he arrived. She was wearing a jacket he hadn't seen before. Her hair different, shorter. She looked well. She looked, he thought, like herself in a way that had a different quality than before. Quieter, less performed. Hi, she said. Hi. They went to the boxes with the focused practicality that both of them had, apparently, decided on in advance. There was not much to dispute. A set of prints they bought together at a market in Portugal. He said she should take them. She said she'd feel strange keeping them. They agreed to donate them to a charity auction. A set of tools that were his, cookbooks that were hers, the easy things first. After about an hour, they sat on the concrete floor with the storage unit door open onto the morning, sharing the last of a coffee he brought in a thermos. How are you? She asked. Not as a formality. Good, he said. Genuinely. She studied him. You look it. A pause. A car passed somewhere outside. I've been thinking, she said, about the party, about what I said. She looked at her hands. I've thought about it a lot, actually. I know. I want you to know that it wasn't. She stopped. Began again. It was careless. What I said and the way I said it. It was careless with you, and I've been understanding that slowly. He looked at her steadily. Not forgiving, not hardening, just present. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, he said. I think that's almost the thing. She looked up. If you'd meant to, he said, it would have been anger. This was, I think you just stopped thinking about what I could hear, which is a different kind of thing. She absorbed this. He could see it land. That's very precise, she said quietly. Yeah. He looked out at the morning. I had a lot of time to think about it. The silence between them now was not empty. It was full of everything that had already been said, and the awareness that there was nothing left that needed to be. I think I was looking for you to rescue me from something, she said, from feeling invisible. And that was never going to be your job, I just didn't know that yet. I could have asked, he said, instead of waiting for you to feel okay. He paused. I kept thinking that if I was consistent enough, I don't know, land. I know, her voice was quiet. I know you did. Another car passed. A bird somewhere. Are you seeing anyone? She asked, not with hope or challenge, just carefully, as a person who has earned the right to ask something difficult and knows it. No. He considered. Not yet. I think I'm still figuring out who I am without the marriage, which I should have been doing while we were in it, probably. She smiled faintly, the specific smile of someone who recognizes something true. Yeah, me too. They finished packing the boxes. He helped her load 2 of them into her car. They stood in the parking lot in the September light and looked at each other with the particular attention of people who understand that this is a last time. I'm glad we had what we had, she said. She said it as a statement, not a consolation. So am I, he said. He meant it fully. That was what surprised him. Not the sadness, which was real, but the fact that the gratitude was real too, and neither canceled the other. She got in her car. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched her drive away. He stayed there for a moment in the empty parking lot. The storage unit door was still open. He went back to pull it down, and as it closed with a low final sound, he stood in the quiet and felt the full weight of everything that had happened. Not a story he was telling himself, not a lesson, not a before and after, just a life, a real and actual life with its grief and its grace and the long, uncertain road of what came next. He walked to his car. He had promised Theo dinner. He was, he realized, mildly hungry. He drove. What stays with you after a love has closed is not the ending. It is the ordinary mornings, the coffee before she woke, the window above the sink, the frost on the unfinished yard, the small and faithful things that no one witnessed and no one could take apart. They stay. Even when everything else has learned to move on,